Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2. We are Polar Star Cybersecurity Group, where we specialize in making sure security isn't a drag on growth. My name is Jackie. I specialize in operations and strategy for product security.
And my name is Max, and I specialize in technical product security work, doing offensive and defensive security so that you can build a program that can actually scale.
So today we're talking about vulnerability management. When we talk about vulnerability management, we often think of one thing: ticket systems. But we are going to change that narrative today and tell you how it is very much not a ticketing system. It's not a scanner, it's not a Jira queue, and it's not a monthly patch scramble. So we are going to be talking about vulnerability management as it is and should be, which is a program. A life cycle that starts at architecture and design and follows that risk all the way to production and monitoring, prioritization, so on and so forth. Because the truth is, as we've talked about, as we've shared a lot on our website and other posts that we've made, most organizations, they don't have a vulnerability management program. They do have a vulnerability notification system. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, how you change your system into a true program. So let's go ahead, we'll start. When most companies say they have vulnerability management, what do they actually mean?
Yeah, I think when a lot of people say that they have a vulnerability management program, what they really mean is that they have something in place that scans for vulnerabilities. And just to kind of level set here, as a vulnerability, this is kind of just something that they see as a weakness. Maybe it's a technical flaw, a technical weakness. There are a lot of commercial off-the-shelf scanners that can go and find problems, right? This might be from publicly available data, doing some sort of testing, but basically it's generating a huge list of problems. And nowadays, with the scanning becoming much more of a commodity, and what we find is that it's not so much that people are having trouble understanding what problems they have trouble understanding what problems they should work on first. And I think this seems to be the case for all sorts of different things across the business, but in security especially, when we have traditionally focused on weaknesses and how we can strengthen them, we've gotten this huge flood of issues that we just don't know where to start.
And that's where a program can be really, really helpful. So the difference between just vulnerability scanning and vulnerability management program is one is identifying problems. The other is figuring out which problems we actually need to go ahead and address, right? So should vulnerability management start at production or is it at architecture? Based on your experience, what do you think works best? And also tell me what's practical.
Yeah, I think in a kind of ideal sense, we always want to look at things in production. And I think one of the challenges with that is that you may not be able to capture information in production at all times that you know of, right? In theory, I think in production makes the most sense, right? This is exactly how we want to do it. But when it comes to building out your vulnerability management program, it can be very difficult to make sure that you can get your scanners in place, make sure that they can run against production systems, and verify that they're not going to have any sort of disruption, right? You have to start in a testing environment. You're going to have to start in a smaller place. And this doesn't mean that it's over for you, right? And that you're not going to have accurate data. We start in a testing environment, and then we validate whether or not that is actually in production, whether it's a specific line of code that's in there, whether it's a specific version that's released out there, right? If we want to move into a full production environment, that works, right? But we need to make sure that we have the processes in place to not affect the reliability of our systems.
So when we talk about where should vulnerability management start, you're saying it should start in production, but it's difficult to because
Absolutely, yeah.
What reason?
It becomes difficult to do it in production because we may not necessarily have all the visibility we need into what's happening into our production environment. Today.
I see. So you need to set things up, right, to be able to have that visibility. But we recognize that setting those things up are difficult. It takes time. And sometimes it's just easier to start earlier, which is at the code level.
Correct.
But what are some of the trade-offs, right? Because we hear a lot about this whole shift left thing. And arguably, have we shifted a little too hard to the left?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest trade-offs comes down to context. If I'm sharing information to an engineer, for example, where a security finding that we've identified has happened at a pre-production environment, or maybe even, it hasn't even entered an environment yet, it's just entering into our code pipeline at that point. Then to justify the importance of whether or not this should be worked on right now or resolved can be a bit challenging. And that's where it comes from our program itself and how we define our priorities as to what is permitted to enter production. And if it's in production, how does that compare? How does what we see at the code integration level compare to what's already existing today?
Okay, so let's talk about the program then, right? So it's not just about scanning, finding problems. That's easy stuff. So when we talk about program, what exactly do we mean? And I'll kind of start. When we talk about a program, it's really having different stages and levels in which security needs to be involved. So we look at the software SDLC, software development lifecycle, and we look at it through beginning to end, all the way to when it's production. It really is that life cycle. And we insert security. Security has different roles in each and every one of those. So the first one really starts with design, right? Design needs and requires visibility. So the question is, how do you actually know what you have? So most companies, when they start out, they're building really quickly. They're not necessarily the best at documentation, which is fine, right? You're trying to move fast. But when security starts becoming a priority, how do we get that visibility when there isn't really a whole lot to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now in the market, we see there are a lot of software vendors that can help you with that space, right? But before we get into the complexities of adding on new technology that we're going to have to manage, provision, and administer across the organization, the most simple exercise we can do is to ask ourselves, what is our product today, and how do we split that up into the domains that we already have? And a really common way that we see this being done is based off of the engineering teams that are within the organization and what they own.
So asset management, we would say, asset management is kind of the silent dependency of vulnerability programs. It's something that we think is already there. We don't have to worry about. We're kind of working off of tribal knowledge. But without that documentation, it's hard to bring on new people and get them to work fast, because to learn through tribal knowledge, especially as you scale and your business grows, becomes harder and harder. And I've experienced that firsthand. So take the day to just write down, what products do you have? What engineering teams do you have? Just put a bunch of boxes together, right? So that at least you can contextualize how it is you're actually approaching, right, product development.
Yeah. And, I think one thing that I see a lot is that this can become a very messy exercise really quickly if we just kind of assume that this is, if you take it as some massive spreadsheet homework assignment and it's not actually being used for anything, then yeah, there's not going to be any real value there for you, right? This is going to be not a great use of your time. What problem are we trying to solve for here is to understand what is of importance to our organization, and also to know what are those parameters that we're looking at that indicate that this is important for us, right? We could have, for example, some sort of feature that is, in test and it's not really used that much, for example, and that could be something that we want to keep our eyes on, but we don't necessarily need to put a lot of security resources into it today.
That's a really good point. So when you're doing this exercise, the point is not to be exhaustive. You don't need to be accurate. And I think that is kind of a double-edged sword with security. We always want to be technically correct. I've worked with a lot of engineers who are very, very technically strong, and I think that mindset is a huge plus. But when it comes to an exercise like this and just trying to get something off the ground, a program, right? You just have to go with what you've got so that you can begin having the correct discussions. And the first one is, of your products, it doesn't have to be broken down correctly. As long as you've got the buckets and you can have those discussions, you're on the right path.
Yeah, and I think that kind of comes down from the first step, is understanding what's the scope of our program today and writing that down, because it is inevitably going to change over time, and how we improve our coverage is also going to get better over time. But we can't improve unless we actually document what do we have today, even if it's not something we are super happy with right now.
Right. So for fintech companies, if you are a digital wallet, right, there may be very specific APIs that you've got teams working on. That's what you're going to prioritize. That's what you're going to kind of first start with. And then as your program matures, as you figure out what processes work well, don't work well, you then expand that scope slowly but surely, but knowing that what you're doing is actually working.
Yeah. And I think if we were to walk through a bit of an exercise, right, the first step that we would do is to understand what are the kind of primary services that we offer that provide value to our users. And then from those services, understand what teams actually own those services. And then from those, then we can start breaking down to the specific APIs that are served by them. If we don't have a full exhaustive list or inventory of them, today, that's okay. That means we have a control gap that we might want to address in the future. And then how we want to do that and at what timeline, that is a discussion we can have after we've already kind of reviewed where our needs are.
And arguably, engineering already has a breakdown of this. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. For security practitioners, I think a lot of people like to. They're like, oh, we got a better way to do this. But just piggyback off of existing infrastructure within your organization. Use it, because that's going to be the common language that allows security to actually do effective work amongst the team and to collaborate a lot more fruitfully. So as the company grows, right, there's this idea of continuous visibility. So we're working on things, but how do we make sure that these things, like, we stay on top of?
Yeah. I think one of those first areas, and I've seen this a lot as well, is that as we grow, we start to have new product lines, which is awesome, right? We have new distribution channels that we work through that also might leverage the existing products that we have today. And then on top of that, we also have new APIs or new changes to existing APIs or existing product lines. And so really understanding what does the release process look like for our organization, and then seeing how can we embed our security practices and mold it around that. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see is that we assume that there is a one set way to do things. For example, like it must go through, this CI integration, and then after that, then it goes through some testing, and then it does so-and-so, right? These are a lot of assumptions that we make in our process. And in a very mature process, yes, we have a governance framework and an ability to govern the program to ensure that all these steps are followed. And if they're not, you have these deviations that we can then verify against, right? But in a much younger company, we are unlikely to have these. We probably have other, softer spots, I'd say, that we have a immediate code change we need to make because a customer called about an issue. We want to fix that as soon as possible. And that also opens an avenue from changes to be, go unobserved by security. And whether or not that is something that we want to accept as a risk is a conversation we need to have with our organization and decide where do we want to invest our resources. And then going back to what you mentioned earlier, building on top of existing infrastructure and workflows within the organization first.
That's true. I think it's important to just recognize how things operate today and just use what you've got, right, to be as productive as you possibly can. And as you start identifying roadblocks or perhaps bottlenecks, this is the opportunity to bring up a business case to say, hey, we need to do something better. And give me the time, right, away from firefighting to develop a better process so that this firefighting isn't happening constantly. And that's a conversation that just needs to be had with management, and something if you present it in a way that makes sense from a cost perspective and an effort perspective, right, they're absolutely going to jump in on, because every growing, scaling company, they're all focused on process. So if you can do that, that really kind of props you up just from a career perspective as well, to be able to have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and speaking on that, a good question to ask from an operations standpoint is, how have you seen leaders who have kind of been going through an entire firefighting experience, whether it's a security program or not, and how can they set, what kind of steps can they do to make sure that they can build out the foundation of their program while still maintaining, keeping the fires at bay that they need to?
So it really depends on how big your team is, right? So if you are an organization that's really just starting out, you may have one, maybe none, security teams, security members kind of helping you support some of these firefighting aspects. So the first thing I would recommend is take a step back. A lot of the firefighting you're doing, if you waited a day, even 2 days, what is going to happen? Like, truly ask yourself, is the world going to end? I think because our heads are just kind of so stuck, like at a certain level of the business, we often forget sometimes these things just aren't that big of a deal, right? Fixing a CVSS that is critical, but doesn't really, get hit that much, and you only have, a couple thousand customers compared to the millions that are out there. You got to put it into context and ask yourself, is this worth that time? Or if I put in a process today to prioritize which one of these CVEs are the ones I need to focus on, which one will be better for the business? It's all about the business and what's going to benefit them. And at the end of the day, the revenue, the money that goes into that business's pocket. Because being able to speak with that kind of language that's what's going to put you on top. That's what's going to get you a seat at the table to have the conversations you need to get the budget you need so that you're no longer doing it yourself. And so that's the most important thing to keep in mind. So with that said, the operational mindset really does shine when it comes to creating a vulnerability management program and moving out of just the firefighting, ticketing sort of aspect that we kind of think of vulnerability management today. So how should exploitability, asset criticality, and business context factor into prioritization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the discussions that we are seeing in the security industry today is that exploitability, reachability are both things that are extremely important. I kind of want to make a distinction here, and before I go deeper into this, exploitability in a lot of context for vulnerabilities really comes down to whether or not it can be exploited in the first place. Is there an exploit available, right? Can we demonstrate that it can be exploited, or is it just an issue that we know about, right, that could cause a problem? And now reachability is very specific to the context of the organization. Is the vulnerability that we're discussing, is there an actual attack path? Is there an actual route to trigger it, right? And so there are a lot of new sort of awesome technical tools and analysis that can help you to get to that answer. But both of these things help you to really just determine likelihood.
So if you were to distill it, what is the difference between exploitability and reachability?
Exploitability means that is it possible to actually do something with this security finding? And then reachability is it possible to actually do something within your environment with this security finding?
So then this is kind of where we make that distinction, because I think CVSS is something that a lot of people put a lot of weight on, right? But it only really means something if it's within the context of your business. So exploitability, CVSS strictly, okay, it's exploitable. But then is it reachable? Is this CVE reachable within your environment? Is that kind of the difference there?
Yeah, that is exactly the difference that we need to be able to distinguish between.
And that's the kind of conversation that security partners have to be having with their engineers. Just because you see something from a tool doesn't necessarily mean anything within your business. And I think the biggest frustration that engineering partners have is when security teams start crying wolf, right? They're like, oh no, this is a problem. So engineers are like, okay, cool, I believe you. They go into their environment, they check, and guess what? It's completely irrelevant to the environment in which they're working on. Once you do that 2, 3, 4, 5 times, eventually, just like the story where, the boy who cried wolf, when the wolf does come, nobody's going to give you the time of day. So it's something that you have to really be careful about, because trust is everything, especially in security, and especially amongst the partners in which you're working with within your organization. So, all right. Is patch everything fast actually responsible risk management?
Well, patch everything fast, if we kind of think about that, right? In theory, yes, if you can patch everything as soon as you can, then you'd be in a pretty much more secure spot than those who cannot, right? So your speed to patching is definitely an indicator of how much risk that you can reduce. However, there is a cost associated to every patch, every single update, every code change that we make. Whether, from a security standpoint, we might look at it from a dependency single line of change, right? But from an engineering standpoint, that can be, a breaking change that happens from an engineering side, where we then have to update something like our database, the way that it's used, right? So there are major updates that we do have to be considerate about that take much more effort than just what on paper looks like a single line of change.
Right, so I guess patch everything fast is great theoretically and in an ideal world where you have all the money and all the talent. But reality is you don't have all of that, right? And so patch everything fast isn't responsible risk management. It's idealistic risk management. And as with any business, you have to, as a security leader, as a security practitioner, be able to make those little trade-offs every single day, and understand what is the priority of the business. Based on that, this is what I'm going to do. It's kind of like if we were to use an analogy, like eating healthy, right? Or trying to be healthy. Oh, I should go on a run every single day. But, I've got a 9-to-5 job. I might have 2 kids. I've got to cook dinner. I've got to take them to soccer practice. Is that practical to go on a 1-2 hour run every day? Arguably, you could say I can make the time for it, right? But guess what? You're going to be really tired. Are you going to have the energy to do the other things that maybe matter more? So instead of running every day to stay healthy, maybe you choose eating healthier, right? You choose different avenues to kind of reduce or mitigate that particular risk of being unhealthy to get the same sort of outcome. All right, so, that is all about risk prioritization. That's kind of the hardest part. Now, remediation as a cross-functional system, that's something that we like to talk about a lot. So if we were to move just beyond tickets, why do remediation SLAs fail in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the times I've reviewed a lot of information security policies, and they almost always will have some sort of SLA based on a priority, right? And all of these arguably are very arbitrary, right? You might say something critical, 7 days, we'll get that done, right? High, 20 days, we'll get that done, something like that. And really, when you're looking at it, right, the reason why these tend to become problems in an organization is because security then uses these priorities and these kind of SLAs and timeframes as a way to force certain changes that don't necessarily align with the business consistently.
It's almost like a threat. Like, if we don't hit it, we're going to be past SLA.
Exactly. And then we say, hey, you're out of SLA. This is out of policy. Now, if it's out of policy, what you will end up seeing is that in the beginning, you might start to see some change happen where we start to, hey, we need a little bit of extension on this, until at some point, all of your metrics are going to show that a lot of things are going out of SLA. And if they're going out of SLA, the next thing that we would start tracking to measure this is that we'd be looking at what's the time frame from the SLA and how much time we've extended. Is there a deferral that we're requesting at all? And if not, right, then that means security is not really in a strong partnership with their stakeholders to understand what's the reason behind us not being able to hit those SLAs.
And I think this is when a program truly becomes and shows up as a program. If you don't know why these things are not hitting within your policy, you don't have a program, right? You have to know the reason for why and be able to assess and change and edit. Because like you said, a lot of these numbers are straight up arbitrary. We need to start with something. That's with anything, right, out there in business. And once you say 20 days, 15 days, 7 days, whatever it may be, and consistently we're not hitting that number, it's because your policy is bad. So what do you have to do? Fix that policy. Figure out what is the core root cause, right, of why we're not meeting the set benchmarks that we've set for ourselves. Could be because we said it's an arbitrary number, or there could be other things. Again, if you cannot answer why, you don't have a program. And that's something you need to fix.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest mistakes I see with security leaders who are presenting metrics on vulnerability management is that we often see just a list of priorities. They'll say, this is how many criticals, how many highs, how many mediums, and so on, and here's how many we have out of SLA. And because that's the only data that's being presented to their business counterparts, right, there's no context behind what that really means to the rest of the organization.
It makes sense why everyone thinks that security is just a ticket IT function if you're just talking about tickets.
Exactly. And I think one of the problems there is when you present this type of data to the cross-functional stakeholders, if there's no action I can take because of these metrics, and the only arguable action I could say is, hey, I need engineering to hold their horses on what they're delivering so we can have a fix week, then
you're going to have a problem.
You're going to have a challenge, because is that going to be aligned with the business? Unlikely, right? Unless we can demonstrate that this is such a big pressing security problem. Some organizations might actually have one of those, right? But this is coming from engineering culture and security culture being aligned with each other in terms of what they're presenting as a priority, as opposed to trying to flood the gates with a bunch of kind of alerts and numbers and say, hey, we have to do this thing because our policy said so.
So what's the relationship then between vulnerability management and engineering velocity?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, because we often see that vulnerabilities, like the increase of vulnerabilities, does have kind of an impact on engineering velocity, and only when engineering decides to do something about it. In reality, what ends up happening is that when we start flooding the gates with a bunch of tickets and a bunch of vulnerabilities that need to be fixed, right? We get a lot of complaints. Right?
Makes sense.
You're going to get a lot of complaints from engineers who are saying that, this is coming out of nowhere, that they have a lot of other things to fix, a lot of other things to deliver on, right? And the primary impact is that they just simply won't get done.
And you got to remember, you as security, you're competing against, paying customers who are complaining about certain features not working or not working the way they expect, and yourself, which are, these CVEs that are coming from some sort of tool.
Right. And I think really at the end of the day, it's to the detriment of, the security team themselves, because by kind of going down a path where all they're doing is producing tickets and not really communicating back the priority back to the business, and linking them to why we even need to work on them, then security teams end up getting ignored, and they don't build the trust that they need with their engineering teams. And the biggest challenge that we have there is that when security does want to make an actual change and an impact to the organization, they're unable to kind of build the connections and the partnerships with their stakeholders.
So when should you accept risk instead of remediate it?
Yeah. When we are looking at this problem, the biggest thing that we see, or that I've seen, is that product security leaders, when they work with their engineering counterparts, they'll often get a lot of deferrals as to, here's the information I'm sending you, is like, here's a vulnerability we identified. Maybe it's from a penetration test, maybe it's from a scanner that we did. And understanding where we need to accept risk is a conversation that we need to have with our engineering leaders and our product leaders.
Yeah. And I think for this, it's okay to accept risk. I want to make that very clear, right? The whole, process of being in business, doing something cool, doing something innovative is about doing things that have risk, right? So to accept risk from a security standpoint, you have to be okay with that. But what you need to do is you've got to document that this risk has been accepted, because that means that everybody has agreed that this is okay. In a way, deferral is kind of like accepting risk. So just freaking accept it. And then if it becomes a problem, you'll know exactly why it's a problem, and you can fix it immediately. You can prioritize it immediately, because the whole act of deferring just means I don't care right now, right? So just accept it and kind of move on. And I think that is sometimes a better way to go about it than to just push things off into some sort of backlog that we know has, thousands?
If not more than that, sometimes millions. And I think one of the things here to highlight is this is where the importance of having an actual vulnerability management program comes in, right? Because the program itself would also encompass the scope of any sort of accepted or deferred risk for us to either reevaluate or have certain conditions before we are able to accept it. A really common one might be to build some sort of monitoring controls in place, right? So that we can detect whether or not there is suspicious activity. Does it have to be a perfect monitor? Arguably not, right? If we are able to just create something that helps us to extrapolate that information as to, hey, there could be something going on here that we, with a problem we had found previously, that could be an okay scenario for us to go with, depending on, again, the business context. So we need to have all of this documented and written down as to what are our expectations, and then if this is technology that we need to invest in to get to that point, or whether it is, some sort of tool procurement that we need to have in order to have that capability in-house, now we have a business case for it.
Yes, back to the business case. And just to give everyone out there an example, right? There have been times where there are vulnerability issues that come up, and there are disputes, right? Security thinks it's a problem. Engineering's like, it's not a problem. At the end of the day, it's the business that owns the risk. Security is merely just a guide, a consultant, an advisor. The better the advisor, the more you can really educate people on why it's a problem. But let's say you're unable to do that. The very least you can do is say, all right, we're going to accept this risk, but I want to be able to mitigate it in the way of being able to monitor it. Because if this were to happen, these are the leading indicators that will tell us that this is about to be a problem. And that is where you change the narrative from security being a bottleneck, being a blocker, to we're going to push this along while making sure you're all safe, right? And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, if we go to that scenario, go back to that scenario where, let's say you're in a situation you're not super happy with, where there's a lot of risk that has been accepted, and you as a security professional say, hey, this is completely unacceptable for me as a professional, but this is the decision that the business has made. Then one of the first steps is that you have to be able to build a business case as to why we even need to do better. Or are you just there because you're there as a scapegoat for later.
Yes,
right?
and this comes back to the program. Why you need to have a program, because when these instances do come up, there should be a protocol or procedure that allows you to document all of these things.
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of an example policy that I've seen and how that actually gets implemented in the real world is that we might see, for example, any sort of accepted security risk that we found that have either a critical or high, again, these are kind of arbitrary for the organization unless they've really done a good job prescribing these kind of parameters. But you start with something critical and high and say, for any of these risks, we want to make sure that we have a detective control in place. And we would look through all the things that are already accepted, and we would identify whether or not monitoring controls exist. And then if we want to go a level deeper, then we also perform control validations against them to verify that those monitors actually fire when some weird behavior is actually happening.
Yep.
Right? And this is now information we can present to our engineering stakeholders and say, hey, across the things that we've accepted, we have no detective controls in place here. And so either we need to invest in them, now I have a business case for it, or now I can prove to them that, hey, we're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah.
We have the controls in place. I do want to revisit them, but if then we have to start calculating things like how much effort is it for us to put in a preventative control to reduce this risk.
It allows you to validate, like, did we make the right decision from the get-go or not? And then that continuous sort of loop allows us to make better and better decisions as we mature the program.
Correct, yeah. And I think that important theme here is we're not going for perfect today. We're going for a system, a program that can help us to get better continuously over time.
So that leads us into reporting and executive communication. So this is an area I've seen security leaders really kind of struggle in, right? Because we're so used to kind of the IT mentality, which is to talk about all the tickets and the things that we've resolved. So, what metrics really signal maturity versus activity?
Yeah. So let's first talk about what does an activity metric look like?
Yeah.
As we kind of mentioned earlier, a really common activity metric is going to be how many tickets do we have, how many security vulnerabilities do we have, and then what priority are they, and are they within SLA? What percentage of them are within SLA? That's kind of the most common thing that we're going to see. As we kind of mature, what we'll start to see as they break down is what type of findings are they, right? Are they hard-coded secrets? Are they, code-related issues? Are these infrastructure security problems? Then we start to get to break down a bit. But I think what signals a true maturity sense from a security leader that's now able to communicate at a broader impact to the organization is that each one of these issues are now related back towards some sort of actual business risk.
That's right.
Is it reputational impact? Is it financial impact? And then going further than this, we then start to create some sort of risk calculation, risk scoring for custom and tailored to the organization, that it's not just critical or high because I feel like it. It's I have a repeatable way that if Henry and Sarah from my team, they both decide to assess the risk on a specific finding, they should both produce the same result because we have a deterministic way to label them.
Yeah, you want really consistent risk scoring methodology. Now, there's nothing wrong with having kind of colors or a bit of a spectrum or red, hot, hot, cold, whatever it may be. But those are for less mature programs. Like, you got to start out with something, but over time you need to mature that and make it better so that it's consistent. I remember we had a conversation with somebody and they said, why can't AI just do it? Well, if you're not making consistent decisions every single time, your AI will not be able to make consistent decisions every single time. And they are going to miss some things. And so the better you are at honing what is important and what's not important within your business is going to make it possible for you to actually automate things and reduce that noise. But nobody has really taken the time that we've seen to actually figure that out. And it is a lot harder than you can imagine because it requires you to truly think, wait, why did I mark this as critical? There are specific factors that you use, and those are the things that you need to start kind of documenting so that you find some pattern there.
Yeah, and I've used a lot of these sort of AI security tools to help you find findings, right? And I think that one of the most frustrating things when you first, after you go through the POC, everything's bright colored, everything's working okay for you there. But once you start getting into a full-on implementation and you expand the scope from just 5 repos to now hundreds, if not thousands of them across the organization, then that priority mechanism becomes really important. And one of the most common things I've seen and done myself in the past is I'll just say everything that comes from this tool, it's going to produce some sort of severity. Just down level it by 1. Whatever it says, just down level it by 1. And that's kind of the most common, and that's okay. That's a place to start, right? Because it's already demonstrating that there's a certain level of care that I have. But the challenge is now for every single tool, I have to go in here and then if they do offer, which some of them, you can feature request if they're new, but they'll offer some way to kind of adjust that rating and that scoring system. And some of them are now through plain text. I can insert a policy that I have written up to send it there, or I can use different labels, or then I'll have to use some sort of vulnerability, aggregation tool that I would have built in-house or maybe used from another vendor. So you can kind of see there's a lot of complexities that are involved in building a vulnerability management program. And then to get it fully autonomous, there's also a lot of details I need to have ironed out before I run into these kind of operational challenges.
Yes. So let's talk about maturity model discussion. So this sounds like a lot of stuff, right? To get to that level of detail does require time and effort and a true understanding of what important looks like for our company. And that takes time. But what does level 1 vulnerability program look like?
A level 1, super basic, just means that we're doing something.
You're doing something, and that's great. If you're doing something, congratulations.
Yeah, you're already ahead of very many at that point, right? The fact that you even consider vulnerabilities and security as part of your organization that you need to resolve and that you need to remediate, there is risk involved there, means that we understand that this is an investment towards the future of our organization.
And what differentiates mid-market versus enterprise, speaking of different levels?
Yeah, so from a mid-market versus enterprise, what we see is really just the level of scale and organization that we have within the vulnerability management program. And to put in simple words, the difference between mid-market and enterprise are the types of questions we can answer. And that really comes down to, in a mid-market, which is probably, more, it's like we've built some basic foundations in place. We're doing a decent job, but we can't confidently answer a lot of things. But we can say, here's our average time to remediation on certain vulnerabilities. Here's how we classify vulnerabilities as, a certain critical, high, or something like that. This is super useful when it comes to partnering with, enterprise customers. And we need to be able to have conversations as to, here's why you can trust us. Because when we find a problem, here's how we assess what is a problem to us, and I can prove to you that we actually get it done.
I will say, though, between mid-market and enterprise, sometimes the program maturity looks the same. But the difference is that enterprise just has more money to spend on more people. But the program isn't, honestly, all that much better. Because for a program to actually be working, you need to be able to capture information that tells you what changes you need to make within the program. Right? So just because you've got tickets and you've got more tickets and they're taking less time to address, I need to know what kind of tickets, which ones am I actually working on, which are becoming bigger problems, so that I can invest more of my time and talent and enablement on that particular issue. Because the cybersecurity landscape is always changing. The problems are always going to be different, because what you fixed or was a problem today is no longer going to be as interesting perhaps to malicious actors tomorrow. It's going to be changing all the time. So to be able to proactively see that within your environment, that's maturity.
And I think one of the things I want to call out here for enterprise vulnerability management programs, right, for the enterprise size, it becomes extremely complex when they start doing acquisitions with other companies. You now have separate technology stacks. You now have security stacks that may not be compatible with each other. And now you have different standards across the organization where there are certain product lines you don't care about as much because it doesn't make as much money, either revenue-wise, or it doesn't have the same level of exposure because of the level of the client's connections to them, right? That how they integrate. So managing that becomes really difficult and complex from an operational standpoint, and what kind of exacerbates that same problem with vulnerability management.
I love that you mentioned that, because there are some things that just don't matter as much, and that's okay to say out loud. Not everything matters the same as other things. And I think as a business, especially security, you got to be real honest and transparent about that, because that is what's going to help you prioritize and focus on the right things for the business.
Yep.
So if you were building a vulnerability management program from scratch tomorrow, what would you be doing differently?
Yeah, I think when I had first built my first vulnerability management program and being part of that, right, the biggest mistake I made was going with, all right, let's just produce findings. Let's share with people what we have. And coming from a pen testing background, I would always have brought in, specific components about reachability. For me, if it wasn't reachable and I can't even prove it, it's going to be hard for me to even justify this is worth working on. That was kind of the basis of almost every single vulnerability that we had ever shared with our engineering teams. It's not to say that if there isn't a way, sometimes it's a time limitation. I literally can't prove it within the time I have, the amount of tool, findings that we have. And that's starting to improve with some of the new enhanced tools, the AI-powered tools. That's useful, but you've got to build a business case for why that's useful for your organization. Because they're expensive, right?
Right.
It's not like it's free. And even operating your own open source version, also not free. That aside, the first thing I would work on and focus on is understanding the level of relationship that security has with their engineering stakeholders. And this comes down to measuring something as basic as deferrals. And it's really simple because if I issue some sort of, vulnerability ticket, let's say, and it doesn't get remediated in a certain time, then the next step for me to measure is when I went to go talk to the engineering leader, did they request a deferral? Did I at least notify them that there is a specific SLA that we have, that maybe it's a policy we set, arbitrary is okay, right? That means that we've had a conversation with our engineering leader that this isn't a priority for them for what reason, right? And then now as I can start to build out the rationale, either it's the most basic form that we had started with was just comments on tickets. Are they kind of messy to deal with? Yes. But as now we have some of this AI powered generation that we can do, AI generated content we can also use it as a way to summarize the comments. So a really simple workflow that you can create from it is read through all of the ones that we've already had that are deferred, read through the comments, and then extrapolate what are the reasons for us to be deferring it.
So it sounds like the first thing that you would do differently is really get a better handle on what is security's relationship with engineering, right?
Correct.
Before I start producing all these problems, bombarding engineering with things that they need to fix, it's all right, what is engineering willing and wanting to listen to from security? Because regardless of how many issues you do eventually produce, if it all goes into a black void anyway, are you really doing anything to move the business forward? Arguably, no. So first things first is, understand who your partners are, listen to them. This is the same in any business. You want to understand your customer. For security, it sounds like the customer is your engineering partners because you can't really get anything done without them. You have to make sure you have a very strong working relationship with them. And engineers, from what they're all very helpful. Like they all want to solve problems. Like that's what makes engineering so good at what they do, is they're great at solving problems. And so if you say, hey, why aren't you fixing this? They usually have a pretty good answer. And that answer, oftentimes, what have you heard?
Is that they have better things to work on.
They've got better things to work on. The business priority is different. It is not aligned to what security is trying to do. So you've got to first understand what is that business priority, and then fit security in. This is how you build that security culture from the bottom up. And that's usually how it works. People don't hire a CISO, right, at the get-go. They hire some security person who just happens to know how to implement things. But if you want to change the culture, the narrative, that's how you really got to get going around vulnerability management programs. Cool. So that's all for today about vulnerability management and how it's not just a ticketing system. It really is a program. If any of you guys have questions around how to make your vulnerability management program better, please reach out. We love this topic. This is arguably our favorite topic of all. And we've done a lot of research and work on what good looks like. So we'd love to engage in that discussion and share with you what we've seen and what we've learned.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed this discussion, and best of luck on your vulnerability management journeys.